Everybody for coming out this early on a Saturday morning, and welcome to the Saturday session of this Dangerous Ideas for Dangerous Times. So we had a great day yesterday. I hope some of you were there with us today. We're looking forward to a great day today. My name's Penny Higgs. I'm convener of Stop the War Coalition in Manchester, and I chaired the People's Assembly meeting in Manchester last week with 700 people. I'm guessing this might be a bit of a tougher task, I don't know, but let's look forward to a constructive discussion on the left. And what's the point of the left? We've got our panel of speakers here really, which are just here to set the context for the discussion or the conversation, let's hope. You can't, I'll shout really loud. I'll stand up, how about that? I'll stand up. So did you hear who I was? But that doesn't really matter. So we've got Chris Nineham here from Counterfire and author of this book, The People versus Tony Blair. We've got China Mieville, who's author and novelist, activist in the International Socialist Network, and Laurie, who's contributor to the New Statesman. So I think we've got a great kind of context here for a constructive discussion on the point of the left. So these guys will kind of speak for a few minutes to set the tone, and then we'll open it up for, hopefully quite constructive, snappy, and good contributions and questions about the thing that we all face, the conundrum we face, where we see a lot of people moving into the fight against austerity. We've seen a lot of upsurge in interest in opposition to the government, and how is the left going to respond to it? So I'm looking forward to that. So I'll ask Chris Nineham to start us off, please.
Thanks, Penny. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I hope conversation is the word, because I think it's quite important that we make sure that the discussion from the floor doesn't descend into a kind of internalised discussion amongst socialist groups, which is obscure and has no kind of relevance to the wider world. And I say that because I think we face a very, very serious situation at the moment on the left, obviously, it hardly needs to be said. And secondly, because I think when you start asking the question of what's the point of the left and what does the left need to do, it seems to me almost self-evident that one thing we need to say is that the left needs to break out of its bubble and needs to stop being overly self-absorbed and actually try and connect, make itself relevant to the thousands, literally millions of people in Britain and elsewhere who are facing various degrees of catastrophe as a result of the actions of the elite. It seems to me that the situation is, really acute. What our rulers are doing is not just implementing a kind of package of cuts or even actually responding to an economic crisis. I think what's happening is that austerity is a way, it is being used as a way of pursuing an agenda that has been going on for 3 decades now, of a kind of re-engineering of society in favour of the rich. What we're talking about really is the tearing up of the post-war welfare consensus, the breakup of the kind of society that our parents and to some extent at least the slightly older of us were actually brought up in. And when you get an assault on that scale, everything is thrown up into the air. And I think that's the background to the kind of turmoil that there has been on the left and to the kind of debates that have been taken on. When we start thinking about our response and how the left should make itself relevant, my starting point is this really. I think the first thing we need to say is to kind of slightly misquote an influential 19th century socialist and say the point is to change things. Now that may sound obvious in a sense, but it does seem to me that the only way the left can make itself relevant, can reconnect, can remake itself, is if it is perceived to be actually trying to make a tangible difference to the world. That has to be the starting point, I think. If we're not trying to create a movement that has impact, that really shapes the world in some way, then I really don't see why people should take us seriously. I really don't see why people should have any interest in us. And I really don't see why people should actually pay any attention to our ideas or our vision or our dreams. As I say, maybe this sounds obvious, but I think that one of the problems here is that the last 3 decades, the neoliberal decades, particularly the 80s and 90s actually, have been so grim there have been so many setbacks and defeats for the left and for the trade union movement and so forth, that there's a kind of crisis of confidence. And I think there's a danger that the left forgets a history that has actually been shaped from the Chartists to the new unions in the 19th century, from Cable Street to the anti-fascist movement in the 1970s, the great trade union struggles of the 70s, the anti-war movement. All of these things have been initiatives that have been taken by the left. They've not all won, they've not all been successful, but they have all had an impact on society. And I think it's very important we don't forget that history, that actually the great struggles over the last 2 centuries, obviously not just in Britain but around the world, have played a crucial role in shaping the kind of society that we live in. And we need to get back to that sense and that confidence that we can make a difference. The second thing I want to sort of flag up, it's maybe slightly random, but I think is important, is that I think we need to ensure that we are thinking seriously and strategically about the world that we live in, analysing it carefully, and not falling for the kind of, sometimes a kind of caricatural romantic idea of the way the past has been and kind of transposing that to the present, and not also falling for the image of the world that is projected by the media and by the institutions of capitalism. And I just want to sort of say a few words about the way the ruling class tries to make us think about ourselves and about the movement. It seems to me that if you listen to the media, the world that they portray is one in which workers are either all basically middle class, or they're a kind of precarious, semi-criminal underclass. And that anyway, luckily from their point of view, the whole of society has basically accepted the inevitability of austerity, that they've basically said that, you know, cuts have got to take place. And if anything, they're moving to the right as a response to this, that they're blaming, you know, minorities. Bulgarians, for some reason, we're told that everyone's blaming. Bulgarians are the big, you know, the big bête noire of the British working class, apparently, even though they haven't actually started coming over. But there's this idea that essentially what is happening is society is moving to the right. Now, without going into the kind of nonsense of the BBC's assessment of what class are you in, which I thought was absolutely ludicrous, kind of ludicrous charade, really. I mean, their categories of class actually didn't mention employment. They didn't mention what job you did. They didn't mention any. They didn't have any sense of what people did for a living or their role in the process of production at all. It was incredible. But without going into that, I think the notion that British society has essentially accepted the austerity agenda and is basically moving to the right, I think it's a travesty. And anyone who goes out onto the streets and actually campaigns over any of these issues, and even looking at the opinion polls actually, 35%, according to most opinion polls, of the British population actually think there should be no cuts at all. And that's not talking about the 30-odd% who think the wrong kind of cuts are being made, which you can interpret all sorts of different ways. 35%, about 14 million people in Britain, basically reject the austerity project altogether. That puts them obviously not just to the left of Cameron and Clegg, that puts them way to the left of Ed Miliband. And this is, you know, this is something that I think we need to keep in our minds. And then of course there's the opinion about the wars. I mean, despite the attempt to rebrand the war on terror after Iraq and Afghanistan, despite the kind of attempt to present these new wars as humanitarian, despite the boosting of the military that you get from every section of the establishment, anti-war opinion has actually grown since the end of the Iraq war. I mean, this must really dismay the government, it must dismay the military. It's a real problem for them at a time when they want to continue to pursue these wars. So that's important. And I think this is actually not just this kind of disjuncture between what large numbers of working class people feel and establishment opinion and the sort of, you know, mainstream politics. This is not just a product of the immediate situation post 2008. I think this is part of a pattern that you can discern going back, you know, a decade and a bit more really, which is that I think precisely because of the kind of centralised, intense and very, very ideological attack that we've had by the neoliberals over the last few decades, and actually because of the wars, I think that people's general political consciousness, their general sense of ideas and the kind of world they live in, is way ahead of people's ability and confidence to actually fight over particular issues. I think there's at least amongst a very, very big minority, there's a deep questioning of society going on. It's unformed, it's unspecific, but it's there and it's very, very important. So just to finish, really, just a few thoughts on how that's my kind of take in a very broad brush way of the of the general situation. How do we respond to this? First of all, I don't think primarily the key thing is sort of left propaganda and arguments, or actually proposing alternatives. Those things are all important, but I don't think they're the starting point or the key. And I certainly don't think a kind of denunciation of other political organisations, including Labour, is any way to go here at all. And I think sometimes the left does fall into that trap, because one of the other crucial characteristics of the situation is that despite this radicalisation, and despite the sort of sense of a massive democratic deficit and alienation from the mainstream, even when people's ideas are changing quite rapidly, there are contradictory ideas in people's heads, and it's still the case, however far to the right Labour may have gone at the top table and in terms of their policy, it's still the case that the vast majority of working people see Labour not necessarily with any enthusiasm, but see voting Labour in the next election as being at least a way to get this bunch of vicious clowns out of office, and that maybe things won't be quite so bad. And we do have to factor that in. And I think that you know, people on the left, those of us who believe that you do need to have, we need to confront the situation we face, which is a systemic problem, and that we need a revolutionary transformation of society. Those of us who believe that, we do need to organise together. We need to work together. We need to strategise together. But it seems to me there's no point in us doing that unless, at the same time, and having done that, we try and re-engage with much wider sections of society. I mean, famously, Lenin gave the advice that the Italian revolutionary Gramsci, that he didn't actually take at the time, as he admitted, which is that, first of all, as a revolutionary, as a radical, you separate off in order to just be amongst people that you can agree with and talk to and work together with, but you separate off in order to unite again, in order to re-engage. And I think that's absolutely crucial. It's exactly the people who still half believe in some sort of top-down solution, that if we vote Labour that things will get better. It's exactly those people we need to be working with in order to draw them into activity, to draw them into a mass movement, if we are serious about winning, if we're serious about creating a movement that actually can reach those hundreds of thousands first, and later those millions. And that's why I think that the People's Assembly project is so important. It seems to me, not just because it is going to be, I don't know if everyone knows about it, but there'll probably be discussion about it, but June the 22nd, big gathering of the anti-austerity trade union movement and so forth in London. It seems to me this is important not just because of its size, though actually size does matter, and not just because it's starting to overcome the fragmentation, which is another problem in the anti-cuts movement, but precisely because it is managing to bring together the radicals, the revolutionaries, with people who are asking deep questions but actually have still other ideas in their minds. That seems to me to be the essential model for how we can go forward. And one of the most moving arguments and one of the most convincing arguments, well, there are lots of convincing arguments to be honest, but one of the arguments that's always moved me, that Marx put about the importance of revolution, is that he said that revolutionary struggle is crucial for this reason. It's only in the process of actively transforming the world that people transform themselves. And I think that, you know, we have to bear that in mind. We have to overcome the fatalism and the sense of pessimism about the world that pervades capitalist society and is in danger of affecting the left as well. And to do that, I think we have to work together to make sure that we act on the world. Thanks very much.
That was great. Now our next speaker will be China Mieville. For those of you who came in later, I introduced as being an activist in the International Socialist Network and a novelist. So over to you to contribute to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Dangerous Ideas for having me. And also a second thank you for being very forgiving at my plaintive request after the initial invitation to not speak about science fiction for once in my life. I was grateful for the permission there. I like the title of this session, you know, what's the point of the left? But I have to admit, my favourite title, the original pitch was actually a slightly different title, which I prefer, and I'm slightly sad we moved away from, which was The Left, what's the point? And this kind of made me, I was thinking about, you know, other similar variations that we could also use, like, you know, The Left, OMG, WTF, you know, at the moment, or really the left? And I think, I mean, I really take Chris's point. You know, what we mustn't do is make this a kind of internal conversation. And I think all of us who are activists, whatever organisations we're in, if we're in anything, you know, our orientation has to be outwards. Of course it does. But at the same time, I think if we do take seriously ourselves as activists, as people, you know, within organisations that are committed to changing the world fundamentally, you know, we do have to look also at some of, you know, our own history. We have to look at some of these questions which we might want to sort of say, well, these are internal, we shouldn't have these. I actually think it's very important to have these discussions, and I don't think there's a contradiction between orienting outwards and seriously questioning our own history, our own tendencies, and the situation that we're in. And the reason I like the title of this session, particularly the original title, The Left, What's the Point, is a few things. One is it's humorous, you know, and I think it's quite important that, you know, we approach ourselves with a sense of humour as well as seriousness. Something with which there's been kind of a deficit on the left, particularly the British left, for some time. Another is it breaks a certain tendency towards what can be a kind of hermetic arrogance of the left, that I think has been a really baleful influence for a long time, and something that I think is shifting, and I'm delighted that it's shifting, and I think it's very important that it's shifting. And above all, you know, what this does is it's about humility. And I think it is a political duty on the left, the organised left, the far left, the revolutionary left, to approach the current moment with absolute humility. And to approach, you know, our conversations with other people, these are not about, with people who are not necessarily revolutionaries or, you know, involved in organisations, these conversations, you know, should not be about a one-way transmission of ideas. Now, the problem with this kind of thing is you say this, and of course everyone on the left is going to say, oh, well, no, absolutely, we agree. I mean, part of the problem, I think, that we have to address is that, in some ways, some of the problems that have faced us on the left, formally, we all agree that, you know, we all agree on how to go forward. But I think we have to be quite searching about some of the kind of cultural deficits that have grown up around this. One of the main reasons, I think, to be frank, that we need to proceed with humility is that the left has, you know, committed a major series of derelictions over the last few years. You know, we have had I'm sorry, but it's true, we have had a serious failure to build. Now, this, you know, we haven't built seriously on the left in Britain for a long time, and particularly at a moment like now. That should be a spur to serious humility. We should be looking in and saying, we are doing something wrong. Yes, there are objective factors, blah, blah, blah. You know, this is not about, you know, kind of internal therapy and all of these concerns. This is about taking seriously our project to change society, you know, and we need to approach that with humility, because the second thing, very obviously, as Chris has said, the issues facing us right now are massive and really serious. You know, I'm going to talk about a few of them. You know, the issue of fascism, the issue of austerity, obviously the issue of imperialism, the same list that, you know, there's nothing to divide us on that. And the third, and again, I make no apologies for talking about something which some people might say, oh, this is internal, this is internal. The far left is in a moment of crisis, I think. I think it's in a moment of crisis internationally. I think it is particularly at a moment of crisis in Britain. And I think that it is a dereliction not to address that at this moment. We have to talk about that as part of our project of orienting outwards, as part of our project of engaging with these serious, massive moments, political moments. And that crisis is not over. It's going to get worse. it's going to continue. Now, I happen to be of the opinion that this is, it's like the tarot deck. I think, you know, the destruction of the tower is actually a moment for rebuilding. I'm quite optimistic about this, but there's no point avoiding the issue. So just to talk for a few moments about these big political issues that face us. I mean, the one that is obviously on everyone's minds at the moment is fascism and racism, and I hope, you know, people know that there's a demonstration today, a counter demonstration, and I think it's incumbent on as many of us as possible to get down there. I've just been out of the country for several days, leaving just after the Woolwich murder, and I started to receive emails from many different friends, completely unconnected, in different you know, moments of the left in Britain, all of them saying to me, something has changed, this is really bad. This is really scary. This is a moment that I don't remember a feeling like this. I think, you know, we are on the cusp of a potentially seriously toxic and dangerous moment vis-à-vis the far right in Britain today, vis-à-vis the sudden, extraordinary, vicious wave of Islamophobia, which of course is building on the foundations that have been successfully built of racism and Islamophobia over several years. And obviously that means that what we need to do is to be physically engaging the fascists, we need to be building connections on the, you know, among communities and taking this head on. We also need, we also need an anti-racist theory and strategy. You know, this is not just about the moment. We need to examine our own history of anti-racism and start talking about, you know, how did we get here? What were the ideological roots of this particular iteration of racism that we're in now? And those ideological roots will be political economic roots. They have been built up quite seriously, successfully, and deliberately. And so we need not just the people on the streets, all of us on the streets, which we do need. We also need to be thinking very seriously about racism and about class and the intersection of class and racism and how we engage with that and how we push that forward. In terms of the issue of austerity, I'm delighted that the People's Assembly is happening. I hope it goes very well. I don't want to blur the fact that, as Chris alluded to, there are differences on the left. I think we need to be open about that. You know, I have some concerns about aspects of the way the People's Assembly may work. I do not want to see the left get into the dynamic that I've seen far too many times of a big jamboree followed by a dying fall, then another big jamboree, followed by another dying fall. I don't want this, you know. I don't want to see lots of people, you know, who are experts in their field speaking down, and then the whole thing dissipating. And I hope it doesn't happen, and if I were in the country, I would be there, delighted to be there. I'm very excited by the Left Unity project that Ken Loach has started. And I think building on what Chris has said about you know, the strong affiliation to Labour in terms of voting Labour, even, you know, among many millions of working class people, you know, even if you have no particular illusions about Ed Miliband and so on. Now I think that one way potentially, because my God, these are baby steps, this is a first moment, one way potentially to stop that endless cycle, that kind of Kondratiev wave of jamboree and fall, is to actually start to build an alternative political pole of attraction that can sustain itself as an organised political voice to the left of Labour, precisely because of these contradictory ideas that Chris has been talking about and so on. So I think that it's quite important that the left relate very openly and positively to the Left Unity project and build in that. I hope that goes very well. I want to say one other thing about austerity, is that it is not enough, and this relates to what I was saying about fascism, it is not enough for us to simply oppose austerity, which of course we do, and to build as hard as we can, and to have the assemblies, and to have the organisation and so on. We also need to say, how did we get here? Chris talked about, you know, the last 3 decades. That's absolutely right, but the fact is the left has failed to engage at a theoretical level, on the whole, with the build of neoliberalism. We need to take very seriously neoliberalism as a conjuncture, as a shift, as a serious moment in capitalism, that we can't simply say we are opposed to this, this is about this is about for the rich. That's all true. How did we get here? Are we seriously saying capitalism is capitalism is capitalism? Of course not. We need to have a history of neoliberalism, and as a part of a way of having a theory of shifts in class structure, in the political economy of politics, if you like, the political economy of resistance, that is, you know, we need to go back, again in that spirit of humility, to our theories of modern capitalism. And I think that's something that we need to do very importantly. I won't talk about imperialism at this point because of time. I think the left, you know, we are at a moment where there is a really important opportunity, which is, if you like, almost to sort of accept that things have gone quite badly wrong, and that this should enforce this moment of humility, of looking inwards. The left is trying, the far left is trying to rebuild itself with a spirit of serious engagement with issues, for example, of gender, above all, gender and race, which I think for many years we did not have our ears open to. What we were doing was we had our theories, they became ossified, and then we expounded them. When we go and talk to people about these issues, we need to be learning, not just talking at them. Doesn't mean we don't have our opinions, doesn't mean we don't have our theories and we put them forward, but we should be learning. All of these discussions should be learning. And finally, just to conclude, I think that what we also need to talk about is the cultures that get thrown up on the far left. There is an elephant in this room. I don't want to turn it into a kind of therapy session, but you know, it is an elephant called the SWP. And again, I think this is not unimportant to talk about how we got here. And I also think that this is not a hermetic issue. This is an anecdote. I'll conclude with this anecdote. This is, I swear to God, this is true. This sounds like an anecdote invented by a leftist to prove all sorts of things. I swear this is true. Yesterday I was in Palestine. I was on the West Bank, and I'm going to start doing that thing of, you know, saying Arabic names with a kind of really ostentatious accent now. So I was in the Ramallah, and a young woman, very, very young woman, wearing a hijab, quite a conservative form of hijab actually, turned to me. She's about 22. She turned to me and she said, "So what is up with the SWP?" Swear to God, you know, this stuff matters internationally, and the cultures, and I think that the cultures of what have gone wrong with the far left, you know, which have exploded so seriously in the last few months, but which I think Chris and people in this room would have to accept predate them. The roots for these crises predate what has happened in the last couple of months and go back some years. I think we need to take that on, and as we rebuild, we need to be rebuilding with a spirit of humility, of openness, of theoretical openness, and a completely new conception of democracy, and the democracy and the discussion within the party, within the organisation. See how institutionalised I am? I said the party, I'm so embarrassed. Within our networks, our organisations, our groups. You know, we need to be taking very seriously the slogan that we have put about for years and that became as sclerotic as so many other slogans, which is socialism from below. Thanks.
Could somebody just switch some lights on at the back of the room so we don't fall into a stereotypical darkened room for this discussion? Okay. Lovely, thank you.
No, off here.
We have ours back on.
Just like a light on the matter would be very good. Okay, we'll move to our final speaker for this part of this section. It's Laurie Penny. So I introduced you formally earlier on, a contributor to the New Statesman. I'm very glad to have you with us and contribute to the conversation.
Hi. Firstly, I want to thank Counterfire and the Festival of Dangerous Ideas for having me here. And secondly, I'd like to apologise because I have quite a quiet voice and I speak quite fast. So, and I didn't know there was not going to be a mic, and I also didn't know I was going to be required to speak for an activity. I thought this was just going to be us chatting. So, like, please, I'm not gonna talk for a long time, and I'm certainly not going to be the third white person to tell you all about the anti-racism demonstration that's happened. I mean, it's a very the problem of racism in society right now, and the massive, terrifying fascist train that seems to be coming around the corner as we speak. This is a huge big deal, and there are several demonstrations later today, and one of the reasons I want to keep it short is in order to give people time to, and I hope that we'll keep contributions later short in order to give us time to head down to the demos if we want to, which are reasonably nearby. So a little like China, I think, asked, maybe begged to be allowed to not talk about science fiction. when I was initially asked to speak at this conference, I was asked to give a talk about feminism and on women's issues, which I think are, which obviously are staggeringly important to me. But more and more, I'm seeing this happen, and I'm seeing young women and women in general relegated to a little side room where we talk about our own issues at the side. That's where the women's conversation happens. And I asked the organisers, who were women, if this could possibly not be the case this time. That having been said, I'm now going to talk to you guys about women. Because that is the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's the, I mean, China managed to say the word SWP after about 10 minutes, thanks China. But I think we need to talk about the enormous problem of sexism and rape apologism on the left. And this is not just, obviously the SWP is the big issue here, and this is what has traumatized a lot of people, not just from the SWP but across the British left and the international left. But the problem of race and gender and sexuality on the left is massive right now, and there's a reason why these conversations are happening right now. And when I was thinking about what I was going to say today and what my role here might be, apart from to not be like a bloke talking at you, I think we really it's like a disco in here.
Yeah.
I think we really need to be talking seriously about trauma. I think it's quite difficult for the left to talk about how it's feeling. And I think at the moment, a lot of people I know, not just within the SWP, not just within the ex-SWP, not even within the organised left, although, I mean, organised, but I'm not going to say whatever I was going to say. But a lot of people are feeling really upset and traumatized, and my overwhelming impression I took away from the situation with the Socialist Workers' Party at the beginning of the year, and obviously I was quite involved in that because I was one of the people, I broke the story in the mainstream news, and I was involved, oh thanks, but it wasn't just a platform, but one of my overwhelming impression from that time is of people who were SWP members, and some of them still SWP members, on the phone to me or in bars, just completely distraught, not just, and they're not saying to me just how are we going to organise now. What they're saying is, I am heartbroken. This was my home. This was where, this was where my life was, but this was where my friends were. And I think when I hear people talk about the left and talk about the importance of reaching out and building and contacting people who maybe aren't like us at all, yes, that's all very, very important. But one of the things that I've learned about the left that is most important, whatever we mean by the left, because I think there's been an assumption on this panel that what we mean by the left is the organised far left in party form, which obviously isn't the whole of the left. The function that it serves is a deeply human one. It's a way of building community, and it's a way of making a home for people who haven't had an emotional home, and that's been my impression, certainly over the last 5 years, when my politics have changed really quite profoundly. First with the student movement. I know you're going to laugh at me, but I was very involved in the Occupy movement here and in the US, both as a reporter and as somebody who couldn't stay away because it was such a magical, incredible space. It's one of the reasons that things like the Occupy movements, things like the student movement worked, where the left, the traditional organised far left, had to follow behind, is that they offered people an open space in which to articulate an alternative to despair. And I think right now that has to be the number one purpose of whatever we call the left, because neoliberalism isn't just a set of policies. It's not. Maybe it was once, but right now neoliberalism works by making people isolated, by making us lonely, by cracking down on people's, and even words like self-esteem, which fly around a lot in the American left, right? And I hate it. No offense to Americans, but it gets a bit hippie. But I think it's right. It's right. It's right to talk about emotions. It's right to talk about trauma, and it's right to talk about the effect on us as activists, as people who see ourselves as members of the left, because what the left is for is providing a space, providing an alternative emotional home for people. People are, at the moment, they are refugees from neoliberalism. People's lives are being destroyed. And one of the functions that activism serves is to keep people's lives from falling apart. At the moment, I'm doing work with, a lot of work with disabled people against cuts and with the disability rights, mental health rights groups across the UK. And one of the things I'm noticing is that people who have mental health issues, people who have physical disabilities, where they used to rely on services that are no longer there, mental health budgets in London are being cut by 50% in real terms by 2018, they're now relying on the activist movement. They're now relying on people they've met precisely through the struggle against austerity. And I think it's massively, obviously this isn't the only point of the left, right? But I think it's something that we find really, really difficult to talk about. And one of the things I've noticed with the IS, with people I've known in this, who have left the Socialist Workers' Party, one of the reasons that was so hard for people to do is precisely because of the personal importance to them. And I saw people casting about, what are we going to do now? Where are we going to meet? How are we going to organise? And it's not just about the party form and the money involved in organising and the funds that people need. It's about the structure. I've seen it, and I've seen it on the anarchist left as well. I've seen it in the Occupy movement where people just couldn't let that go. Obviously we have only now got to the stage where we can seriously talk about the Occupy movement being over. Because 6 months after it was really over, you really weren't allowed to say it because people would get really upset and cry. And I don't like people crying. So it's the idea of the left as an antidote to despair is massively, massively important to me. And I think, which is where I want to come back to talking about women and talking about, I was hoping not to get one of those sheets of paper. So over the last couple of months, what I've had a lot of young women say to me, particularly young women of colour, is I no longer consider myself a part of the left because I don't feel that the left is speaking to or for me. I don't consider myself part of the left anymore where I once did. I don't say that myself, but this is what I'm hearing more and more. And I think the traditional organised left in particular has to take responsibility for that. I think what China said about humility is dead on. Because the impression has been given, and not just because of the SWP rape crisis, and I think we really need to use the word rape crisis because otherwise we're just going to be squeamish about it. The message that sent to everyone is women aren't welcome here. People who are not white guys aren't welcome here. People who are not respected high up members of the party aren't welcome here. And I'm not saying that that's actually the case, right? I'm not saying that's the case anywhere in the left, but that's the impression that's being given to the, not just young people, but to the lost people and despairing people who are not part of the traditional left, who are the people who are desperate for that home and for that place to structurally organise and find themselves. And I think, I hope that, I'm going to wrap up now actually, because there was more I wanted to say, but I think we really do need to push on if we're going to give people a chance to get down to the protests. But I hope that that people will raise the issue of gender and race and the issue of how we rebuild in comments and contributions. I'd really like it to be a discussion rather than people yelling at. I mean, there's nothing wrong with people yelling at each other, right? We debate is fine, and baby can be involved. There's nothing wrong with yelling, but I'd really like us to have a conversation because I think it's long past time we started doing that, right? Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. So, wow. So keep your hands up and I will stand up and try and sort of take a note of everybody who wants to speak. But before I do, just the challenge here is to get as many people in as possible. We've got to 11:15, and to be succinct and I'll try and get a spread, because there's people here from various organisations and there's people here from no organisations or disorganised.
I don't mind, which one?
Go on, let him go.
Okay. Can I have 3 minutes?
Go on.
All right. Okay. I want to come back to what Lindsay said about gender. Now, there's a real problem here because Lindsay says, and it's perfectly true, the people in the SWP and organisations throughout the left sincerely fight, racism and sexism. The point of what has happened is that we have to learn that that is not enough. This is about internalised and structural sexism and racism, and therefore all the beautiful thoughts in the world are not enough. And Laurie's been excellent on outlining this exact thing. And to focus on the fact that people are sincerely anti-sexist, for example, anti-racist, perfectly true, but is a recipe for essentially pre-exonerating anyone on the left from checking their behaviour. This is not about intent. This is not about intent. This is about, well, sometimes it is, but mostly it's about structure and internalisation. That is crucial. Building on that, I want to disagree with the person who spoke first, who said, who used Trotsky's water analogy and saying, that we don't want to, essentially it's the argument, we don't want to be too internal and writing these articles using acronyms and so on. But there's an illusion, and it's an illusion that's been made on the left many times, which is that then went on to say, if all you ever do is write those articles, you're going to alienate everyone. Sure, of course, no one's talking about that. But the fact is, similarly, if we pursue the strategy that we have turned into a virtue over years of not addressing ourselves and saying, well, we don't want to look inwards, we don't want to look inwards, we want to look outwards, and that's all we want to do. And if you look inwards, if you talk about the inward stuff, if you use an acronym, you're not focusing on the outside world. It is a recipe for whitewashing and drawing a blanket over our own structural problems. There's no contradiction between building against austerity, writing articles for people who know nothing about the left, and also checking ourselves and writing articles for a slightly different audience sometimes, which is us being worried about us. This is how we grow as a left, and what links up with the question of values and feelings that Laurie has pointed out is crucial and is not a luxury, is part of being a vibrant, serious, lived left, which becomes a pole of attraction for people in this country. I would also say that I think we need to get away from metaphor as political strategy, because you could easily imagine socialists saying, what Trotsky said brilliantly was, all these people are killing themselves by jumping into rivers where there are rocks just under the water, and what we should be doing is discussing on the banks where's the best place to get into the water, and then everyone would clap, So to finally, I'm not having a go, we all do this. I mean, I just think, as 5 fingers we are weak, but as a fist we are strong. Enough with the metaphors. Just finally, in the spirit of humility, the International Socialist Network would like to invite you all to our first public meeting next Saturday at 1 o'clock at Birkbeck University at Mallet Street. And we have some things to say, but we also have a lot to listen to. So please, everyone, be there at 1 o'clock, 8th of June. And thank you again for having me.
Laurie, would you like to?
All right, I'll be really quick. Actually, I wanted to start by responding to Andrea's point, which is about the assembly form and what Tom said about not wanting to be in the audience anymore. I think this idea of sitting around listening to speeches and being in meetings is something that a lot of people feel very strongly right now. The left is in crisis. The idea of how we organise is falling apart, and actually we want a space where everyone can talk, a space where organising can look different and participation can look different, and actually a space where which is less susceptible to being structurally, if not theoretically, taken over by the pale, stale and male brigade, right? So no offence to anyone here. And actually, this is where the anarchist thing comes in, and this is where talking about Occupy still matters. And yeah, you're right, Occupy is still doing some things, but it's not in the same place it was in 2011. One of the reasons it was so attractive to people, and one of the reasons that the anarchists who kicked it off quickly lost control. Obviously, anarchists never really want control, but they quickly lost the control that they didn't want at all. Was that the structure allowed Occupy to adapt, and it allowed the student movement to adapt. It allowed it to move incredibly quickly, to draw in a large amount of people and let people's ideas move forward, let new people come in. And that, if the People's Assembly doesn't do that, then it's not an assembly. It's just another meeting. And that's, I will go. You know, I think what everybody said about participation being important is absolutely right. But we can learn a lot, and we're not at the moment taking our cue from the idea of an assembly. We've got the name, but we've got, as a left, we need to be looking more at why things like Occupy and the student movement worked, and what it is about the format which people find so exclusive and so alienating. And alienation is the key issue here, and I'm not going to go on very long at all, because what I wanted to say, I think China addressed the point about race and gender incredibly well, when I think it's absolutely key to recognise that actions matter as well as theory. How people behave is important as theory. And I would go further and say that one of the things that always happens in left spaces that I've been a part of, and I've come to anticipate with a sense of dread, is people saying, yes, we're all very worried about women and we're all very worried about minorities, but here's the real structure. Yeah. Bollocks. Exactly. Absolute nonsense. Women are your struggle. People who are not white are your struggle. Personally, I'm a revolutionary feminist. I believe feminism is the revolution. I believe that it is fundamental to issues of labour and class and power and sexuality, and we cannot have a left without it. Because if we do build a left without it, then it's tantamount to letting them win, I think, and we don't want that.
Okay, before Chris makes his final remarks, obviously this is part of a whole day of sessions, and the breaks are as important in the meetings, if you like, to carry on the conversation. So I would encourage you to, go back to Firebox, get something to eat and enjoy the breaks. But also, I was quite anxious about the session today, and I'd like to congratulate everybody for the way, that they've participated today.
Yeah, no, just to reinforce that, I think that was a very good discussion, and hopefully that will be a template for how the discussion can be continued from here on in. Clearly there is a crisis on the left, and people have recognised that, and I think, like anything else in society, you can't analyse an internal crisis in isolation from the context and from what's going on around it. Now, I think that the way the rape allegations and the rape case was handled, I think, was terrible. It was terrible for the people involved. It was terrible for people in the SWP, and people like me who've been in the SWP in the past. I think it's terrible for the left, actually, because I think the left has a good record on the questions of fighting women's oppression and questions of fighting racism, but this has actually caused the left major problems, and that's a serious issue. At the same time, the crisis goes beyond that, and I just think it's impossible to believe that a crisis, that the two crises, if you want to talk about it, the crisis of capitalism, the massive kind of turmoil that has been caused by that crisis since then, it's impossible to believe that there isn't some connection between the fact that the left is in such disarray and these bigger events. The two things must be connected, and therefore it is important to come back to the question of how do we deal with the bigger problem, how do we deal with the bigger context. And it's absolutely right to say we need to analyse the situation, we need to assess it, we need to understand it as deeply as we can. But you cannot separate analysis from action. You cannot separate organisation from the bigger political questions. The two things have to go hand in hand, because if you're not out there campaigning, if you're not out there arguing with people and trying to organise people and listening to people, the idea of a two-way conversation ain't going to happen. If you're not involved in the wider movement and trying to grow the wider movement, you're talking to yourselves. That's the truth, and that's exactly what we've got to avoid. And I want to speak in defence of debate and discussion and democracy within the movement. And it seems to me that every major insurgent movement in history has always had institutions where the various activists and people come together to discuss the situation, analyse it, and decide what to do collectively. I mean, there is a class war going on at the moment. The people in power, they decide their strategies behind closed doors, in Whitehall, in the clubs, in Parliament maybe, if you're lucky, and then they go for it, and it's secret, and it's a little cabal of people. We can't organise like that. We have to get together and have a democratic process of deciding how we're going to campaign. I don't know where this idea comes from that the People's Assembly is going to be a talking shop. The People's Assembly was always constituted as a coming together of the movement to decide on action. That's what we're going to do on June the 22nd. We are going to develop collectively a strategy for action to try and break austerity and to try and break the condemned government. That's what we're going to do. It's not going to be a talking shop because it's aimed at action. Now, the Jacobins, in the French Revolution, the Jacobins had their Jacobin clubs. In the Russian Revolution, the revolutionaries had their Soviets, which was all the movement coming together to discuss things. The Egyptian Revolution had Tahrir Square. Was that just a debating shop? Was that just somewhere where people talked? No, of course not. It was somewhere where people came together to discuss, decide, and enact their decisions. And I think that's what the People's Assembly is going to aspire to. I don't want to be too arrogant about it. I don't want to be too, in a sense, too big it up too much. But I tell you, it's going to be by far the biggest coming together of the anti-austerity movement, and its aim is to unite us in action. And I think people say they have reservations about it or some of the people who are going to be there. If you didn't have reservations about some of the people who were going to be there, if you didn't disagree with some of the people who are going to be there, then it wouldn't be serving any purpose at all. Because we want to draw in as wide a layer as possible of people into the movement. People who haven't been on demos before. People who've never been to that kind of public meeting or public event or assembly before. We want to draw them in, and it seems to me the People's Assembly is our big chance, and it's absolutely essential that we take it. Thank you.